welcome to our next session titled Animals in the Machine, a Multispecies Justice Approach to AI Law and Governance. This is a virtual panel session, and I am delighted to introduce our three speakers. Christine Parker is a professor of law at Melbourne Law School, the University of Melbourne, and chief investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision-Making in Society. Professor Parker has a long career teaching and researching on lawyers' ethics, regulatory studies, and corporate accountability. Her socio-legal research has made important empirical, conceptual, and policy contributions to the politics, ethics, and democratic governance of regulation in a range of areas, including competition and consumer protection law, the food system and animal agriculture, the legal profession, environmental and health and safety regulation, and recently, the social and ecological regulation of the digital economy. She has also pioneered the teaching of animal law and food law and policy at Melbourne Law School. Lev Bromberg is a PhD candidate and research fellow at the Melbourne Law School, University of Melbourne. His PhD in the area of animal law and socio-legal studies develops a multi-species account of law and policy, which he uses to evaluate the legitimacy of Australian farmed animal welfare regulation. He is currently considering the implications of the multi-species account of law and policy for the regulation of emerging technologies such as AI. Simon Coghlan is a moral philosopher and a former veterinarian. He is Deputy Director for the Center for AI and Digital Ethics and a senior lecturer in the School of Computing and Information Systems at the University of Melbourne. Simon's research in digital ethics includes projects on companion and care robots for older people and other groups, animal-computer interaction, anthropomorphism and machines, and digital technologies in healthcare. He has interests in applied ethics of various types, including conservation ethics, animal ethics, and medical ethics. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to these three.
So hi there. Greetings from Melbourne, or Naarm in the traditional language, where we're on Wurundjeri country here, and we're enjoying the end of the summer, or the dry season, and coming into what the traditional owners know as the eel migration season. So there are actually three of us working together here. So we're going to split up the presentation between us, and I'm just going to get us started. So our topic is on law and governance of animals or non-human animals and AI and a multi-species justice approach. And I just thought I'd start by saying, firstly, why worry about law and governance and animal rights or animal interests in relation to AI? So as we can see from that graphic, which is slightly out of date because it's from December, AI law and governance is rapidly developing around the world. There may not be any really comprehensive AI regulations, but there's a lot happening in terms of developments in the field and talking about how AI should be regulated and governed. And there's little or no regard for non-human animal interests in most of that discourse at the moment. And at the same time, we have existing laws that impact animals, such as animal welfare laws in many countries, environment and planning laws, laws governing factory farms and so on, that are also going to need to be reviewed to take account for the fact that AI is being rapidly taken up in every industry and every endeavor and is going to be impacting on animals. And so even though, I know you folk are mostly working and studying and so on there in the US, where Trump has revoked Biden's AI executive order, and animal welfare law is very patchy at best. But even so, I think it's really important for animal advocates to be thinking about this area, because at the moment, the ethical norms, the expectations and practices around AI are being developed within organizations, within government agencies, within standardization bodies that make sure that different businesses can talk to each other and use their products and so on with each other. And the things that are happening in all these spaces are going to impact on animals and ultimately influence what ends up being standard practice and what eventually gets solidified into law. So we're going to try and give a bit of a talk about how to prepare for that. So we're going to start with Lev taking a step back and talking about how to think about law and regulatory governance from a multi-species justice approach that takes animal interests seriously, so takes animals seriously as stakeholders. And then Simon's going to talk through the AI animal harms framework that Simon and I developed to try and help think about all the different ways and the rich variety of ways in which AI could harm animals. And then I'm going to wrap up with some practical conclusions about areas where it might be useful for animal advocates to focus. So I'm going to hand over to Lev now to talk about the multi-species justice approach.
Great. Thank you, Christine. In this presentation, we're going to argue that AI law and governance must conform with principles of multi-species justice, which would require a critical examination of the entanglements of AI law and governance with animal interests. In the first part of this presentation, I'm going to discuss why animal interests matter to governance frameworks, including AI, and using a generally applicable account of multi-species justice for regulatory governance that I developed in my PhD thesis. So first, the purpose. What is the purpose of the multi-species account? Since animals are affected by many forms of regulation, there's a need for a generally applicable multi-species account of law and policy. Yet in making public policy and regulatory decisions, the interests of animals are not systematically considered, if considered at all, a lot of the time. And so while animal protection regulation typically focuses on specific policy domains, so farming, experimentation, protection of certain species as well, animals are affected by laws and regulations across all different domains, so not just in that narrow scope. So the central purpose of the multi-species account is the need for animal interests to be systematically considered in developing legitimate regulation and governance. The multi-species account of law and policy bears a family resemblance to environmental justice, ecocentric and ecological accounts of regulation. And what's a common thread of all these is to recognize the awareness of human embeddedness in complex relationships with the non-human world and in opposition to anthropocentrism. But what is different about the multi-species account that we're going to talk about is that it emphasizes sentience. So the idea that laws and policies will impact on individuals with interests of their own. And so the first purpose of the multi-species account is to challenge the latent anthropocentrism of theories, ideas, and concepts that impact on animals. And the second purpose, which is the one that we're going to focus on, is to challenge established and emerging systems of governance, of institutions and processes that comprise those different systems by drawing attention to how they impact on animal interests. The multi-species account of law and policy sheds new light on the affected interests, the information and the values that should be considered in developing regulation and governance. So in a way, it also can provide an important tool, which can be used to facilitate consideration and democratic deliberation by ensuring that the different activities that we undertake, the various institutions that we have, how they impact on animals is being robustly considered. The multi-species account has two elements. So the first of these is interests. Alistair Coghlan, following Joel Feinberg, defines the possession of an interest as having some stake in the good, and to gain or lose depending on the condition of the good. And it's widely accepted, especially, within this room and also more broadly, that animals have interests by virtue of being sentient. They have a subjective experience of the world and the capacity to suffer and to feel pleasure and pain. The idea that animals have interest by virtue of their sentience also underpins the very existence of animal protection laws around the world. And when we talk about concepts like duty of care, the 5 freedoms, all of these are underpinned by the concept of sentience. And the idea of the field of animal welfare science as well really grows out of that assumption, the fact of animal sentience. And while we may appeal to science to inform regulatory decisions or democratic decisions about animals, science alone cannot provide guidance on how animals should be treated. And also the idea of what are the best interests of animals may be contested, given different value-based conceptions of what constitutes a good life for animals. So the second element of the multi-species account of law and policy, relationality, relates to human connections with animals. So this relational aspect seeks to recognize those situations where animals affect or are potentially affected by human institutions or a particular process or system that we're looking at, whether it's AI regulation or environmental regulation or planning law. So this interdependence of human, animal, and environmental health and welfare means that when we make laws and regulations protecting the interests of one group, so for example, animals, this will often further the interests of others too. So humans or other animals will also be affected. So that is something that the multi-species account seeks to recognize in a systematic way. So these two elements of the multi-species account of law and policy, interest and relationality, give rise to animals' affected stakeholder status. Being a stakeholder, having a stake in something, means that one's interests are affected by the activity, institution, or system that we're actually looking at in a particular case. And also, stakeholders may have the capacity to affect those particular activities, institutions, or systems to various degrees. And due to their connections with humans, animals can be affected by laws and policies in a range of different ways. So what I've got there on the slide is just one example of one species, of one animal, and in an Australian context, the European rabbit. And just to show how members of the same animal species are often subject to different regulatory instruments across different domains and are afforded different legal and regulatory protections. And we'll come back to that example in the next slide as well. But the idea that conceptualizing animals as affected stakeholders may at first appear unconventional, and we recognize that that's not how we usually think about animals within the idea of law and policy. At the same time, there's no reason for us to confine the category of stakeholders only to specific individuals or to humans generally. So we already understand stakeholders can include groups or different types of entities. So for example, we think of municipalities, community associations as stakeholders, and stakeholders can also represent both diffuse or narrow interests. So if we think of industry associations as stakeholders or the broader business community as a stakeholder, a single stakeholder as well. And so as well, you can have private interest stakeholders or public interest groups. So environmental NGOs, for example, are seen as a type of stakeholder as well. And one recent example of another non-human stakeholder is a public sector agencies set up to manage, for example, environmental interests. So the rights of rivers in policy making as well. So it's kind of a bit of an evolving space as well. While animal protection regulation in Australia and also in other jurisdictions typically focuses on specific policy domains, so got prevention of cruelty, farming, experimentation, protection of certain species. Animals are profoundly impacted by laws and policies beyond this narrow scope and those kind of divisions. Yet in making public policy and regulatory decisions, the interests of animals are not systematically considered. So again, to come back to the example on the previous slide, just focusing on the European rabbit, we've got prevention of cruelty legislation in the states and territories in Australia, where it's an offence to be cruel to a companion member of the species under the general provisions. But at the same time, we've got biosecurity legislation on the slide as well, where it's actually there is a positive obligation under those legislation to manage those rabbit populations, which includes killing them via poison baits, because they're classified as a pest animal under those legislation. So very different rights of the rabbit depending on where they're born. And so our regulatory systems are anthropocentric, which means that they tend to ignore the entanglements between humans and other animals. So again, coming back to that example, farmers are permitted, indeed they have to, under certain legislation, to control those rabbit populations because they might destroy crops or pasture, leading to financial losses. But then there's also the other animals within the ecosystems, including the farmed animals and the animals that might compete with the rabbit food, predators that prey on those animals, and the rabbits themselves. That's not going to be captured in kind of conventional ways of thinking about law and policy. So there is a need for effective regulatory frameworks that systematically recognize those interdependencies, the entanglement between, in this case, looking at kind of established forms of regulation, but also what we're going to talk about later, emerging systems and technologies and how they might mediate or affect those relationships. And so this anthropocentrism of our existing regulatory systems, such as our animal protection laws, largely ignore animal interests, and often those interests only matter to the extent that they're championed by humans. So they require particular more powerful humans to represent them and their interests. And so that is one reason why animals are particularly vulnerable. And the other reason is often the interests are not of those animals are not reducible to those who kind of manage them or are responsible for those animals. So that creates potential conflict as well, which make animals as vulnerable stakeholders. And so those existing animal protection laws, they either explicitly or implicitly often recognize that some animals comprise a affected stakeholder constituency. So in those example of the animal protection laws, which are set up purportedly to protect animal interests. But to account for the fact that animals are profoundly affected by regulation in a myriad ways, adhering to principles of multi-species justice requires broad-ranging and systematic reforms. In particular, there's a need for appropriate regulatory and policy responses in rapidly developing areas, such as AI governance. There's also a need to ensure that those existing regulatory frameworks I've been talking about are responsive to evolving circumstances, scientific evidence, and community expectations. And it's widely accepted that evaluating the costs, benefits, and impacts of regulation is a critical element of policymaking and regulation. And so our view, and we're going to be coming back to this, is that a practical way of ensuring that animal interests are robustly considered would be by undertaking animal impact assessment of laws and policies. And so one example of this that has been implemented in the last couple of years is the UK's Animal Sentience Committee, which was established 2 years ago. And what that committee does is it's empowered to assess and report on whether the UK government decision makers have considered animal interests and how UK government policies might harm animals. So as part of our presentation, Simon's now going to outline the harms framework, which can be used to operationalize those kinds of animal impact assessments in an AI context.
Thank you very much, Lev, and hello to everyone there. Great to be here. So I'm going to talk now about an AI animals harms framework, which we have developed in the paper. And we developed this framework because of the concern about the many ways in which AI and newer forms of machine learning in particular may impact on animals in all sorts of ways. And these ways are many and various. So non-human animals are already bound up with things like precision livestock farming, the monitoring of animals and tracking of animals in conservation, the use of the Internet of Things in people's homes, and the use of things like microchipping to track individual animals. Automated robots and vehicles such as self-driving cars, delivery and service drones are another way in which animals are being entangled with artificial intelligence. And also animal-related content on things like social media are also influenced by artificial intelligence. So there's a whole range of ways, and these are just some of them, in which animals are currently affected by AI and could be affected more and more in the future. So to try and make sense of all the multitude of ways in which animals may be affected by artificial intelligence, we've got this harms framework which carves up the kinds of harm pathways that animals might be subject to from this technology into a number of categories. So we've got harms that might be intentional, using AI to intentionally harm animals. And we conceive of this in two different ways. So one kind of intentional harm is intentional harm that's already illegal, or is, if not illegal, then generally condemned by the society in which it occurs. A different kind of intentional harm is harms which are legal. They're inflicted legally on animals and that are generally accepted by the society. The next kind of harm where we talk about is unintentional harm. So these are harms that occur to animals without any deliberateness. And these can also be divided up, these unintentional harms, into harms that are more direct, that more immediately impact on the animal, that are causally proximate in space and time. And then harms that are less direct, so more indirect harms that are causally distal. The final kind of harm there that we talk about is the harms of missing out on certain benefits, missing out the opportunities to prevent kinds of harms that humans already inflict on animals. So this kind of carving up of the different kinds of types of harm or causal pathways to harm is kind of based on some work that was done by the animal welfare scientist David Fraser. And he and a colleague of his thought it important to map out the different ways in which animals can be harmed for a range of reasons. So one was that he felt it's unfortunate that a range of harms given to animals are very easily overlooked. So while we might be concerned, for example, with overt cruelty, other harms, such as the unintentional harms done to animals that are hit by cars or that fly into windows and towers and are killed, these kinds of unintentional harms that humans bring about are pretty easily overlooked. And we need to pay more attention to them. Another reason for formulating some kind of framework is that he points out that certain harms are more avoidable than others. One of his examples there is the kind of unintentional harms that might accompany the intentional harms which are already inflicted on animals. For example, animals killed in large numbers, but there are more and less painful ways of doing that killing. So I think these kinds of harms might be more avoidable than reforming or abolishing old systems that already harm animals, such as livestock farming. And furthermore, some harms are just easier to prevent. So when we have animals that are already under our care, as opposed to in the wild, it's going to be easier in general to prevent their harms given to them. And compared to other harms, which are much harder to control. So an example would be the harms of climate change, the impact on literally billions or trillions of animals in the wild. And a further reason from our point of view for trying to make more sense of the different kinds of pathways to harm that might occur for animals from AI is that some of these harms are going to be easier to regulate. And, for example, harms that are already generally condemned by a society might be easier to formulate laws to protect. And harms that are illegal already are going to be easier to police because they're already illegal. So this is a further reason for trying to make, to present kind of frameworks for understanding these harms. So you might ask, why are we focusing on harms? Why are we focusing on harms to animals from AI rather than benefits? After all, as this conference itself is showing, AI can provide many possible benefits for animals. So for example, AI might be able to make animals that already have pretty decent lives even happier than they already are. However, one reason why we focus on harms is that there's a kind of urgency that we feel to address the more serious and severe harms that occur to animals, such as the intense, prolonged suffering and deprivation that they're often subjected to, as well as the harms of killing. A further reason to that is that we are concerned about how law and regulation might be able to intervene to address some of these more severe harms that are occurring. So let's go back to the framework now and just work our way through examples of the different kinds of harms that might. So let's start with intentional harms here. So intentional harms can be harms done to animals using AI, the harms that are illegal or generally condemned. So an example of that would be AI is designed to harm animals via drones and to locate them in the wild for the illegal wildlife trade would be one example of an illegal kind of harm. And AI can also be co-opted. The AI that's meant to benefit animals to protect them from harm can be taken over and used for illegal or condemned purposes, such as when poachers or illegal wildlife traders hack into AI-enabled conservation drones in order to poach animals. And another example would be when domestic violence perpetrators use various technologies, microchips and the Internet of Things, to track companion animals and humans who they wish to target for harm. There are also intentional harms that are legal and might be generally accepted already by society. So what are some examples of that? AI that's designed to harm animals in a legal way would be AI that might be used to enable more intensive confinement of animals in livestock farming. Another example would be using AI to capture and kill so-called feral or pest animals. So there are some examples from our area of the world. In New Zealand, the drones are being used to deliver poisons to the Australian possum, which is an invasive species or designated as an invasive species in New Zealand. And here in Australia, there is a technology called the Felixa, which is currently being used. The Felixa is a AI camera trap that traps the animal, identifies it using artificial intelligence, and then uses LiDAR to measure where the animal is and direct a gel shot onto the animal's skin or fur. And the animal then licks it off and dies from the poison. So example here would be the Australian, the domestic cat, which has gone wild in Australia and is harming, in many cases, native animals. So the harm here is obviously to the cats themselves, but there's also if the animal in the trap is mistakenly identified and killed. So apart from intentional harms, there's also unintentional harms that we need to take account of, and these can be harms which are more direct. So where ignorance or prejudice, human prejudice or bias is coded into AI systems, such as when self-driving cars are not programmed to avoid collisions with certain animals. An example here again from Australia is where a self-driving car is not adequately programmed to recognize the hopping motion of a kangaroo, so therefore may not stop. And another example is where drones are used to deliver products that might interfere with the local wild animals. There's also a concern that AI being used in things like precision livestock farming might malfunction or might fail to measure the right kinds of things. We'll come back to that point in a minute. And a final concern here, or example here, is algorithmic recommendation systems, say on social media, that promote and amplify harmful videos to animals, such as crash videos or other kinds of harm done to animals. And the other kind of unintentional harm here is more indirect. So as many of you will know, AI has a large carbon footprint, material footprint, and the production of e-waste, the use of minerals and so on, and also promotion of climate change to potentially millions or billions of animals in the wild around the world. Another kind of indirect harm is what we're calling epistemic harms. So where things like algorithmic recommendation systems amplify biases that humans already have, present animals in certain ways to us, such as presenting them as being disgusting or worthy of being killed. And these sorts of representations might help to increase meat eating, or they might also promote the cruel uses of animals or a certain kind of mentality of domination over animals as well. Now, the final category we talk about is foregone benefits. So these kinds of harms occur when AI is not developed or deployed to save animals from human harm, and where instead AI is used in developments that either harm or don't bring any benefits about for animals. So some examples here would be when pharmaceutical companies don't invest in AI or veterinary medicine, where organ-on-a-chips are not developed to replace harmful animal testing, or where environmental and animal groups fail to receive sufficient funding to develop AI for purposes which protect animals from harm. So that's our little framework there. The other point which we make is that this is all very well and good to have this understanding of how harm comes about. But it's also important that we reflect on what harm actually means. So what we mean by harm can depend on our conception of well-being for an animal. That is what a good life is for an animal, what it is that intrinsically makes an animal's life go well or go badly. And of course, this notion of animal welfare or animal well-being is both difficult to make sense of, but also highly contested. So different theories can recognize different intrinsic values as that are part of animal welfare, such as hedonistic values to do with preferences and desires of animals, the capabilities or capacities of animals to act in certain ways or behave in certain ways, and the what is familiar from animal welfare science, the 5 domains model, which takes into account a range of factors, including the mental states of animals. So how we conceive of harm affects what we say about AI's capacity to cause harm to animals, and also how well AI does at making judgments about an animal's welfare. So there's a risk here if we have a wrong or an incomplete conception of harm that will end up making faulty welfare impact assessments of AI's harm to animals. So, for example, if we take a look at these pictures here, if we understand the pigs in the top picture there as having well-being that's measured in terms of their ability to produce meat effectively, to stay within certain physiological parameters, and to have overall good health, we might conclude that they are having good lives. Whereas, in fact, if we take other things into consideration, like the pleasure and pain that animals experience and the relative balance of those things, other affective states that animals might experience, whether their desires desires and preferences are being satisfied or not, and whether they can engage in natural behaviors, like the pigs in the lower part of the lower photograph there, we'll come to different understandings of whether these animals are having good or bad lives and how they're being harmed. And finally, we might also recognize that there could be a thinner and more expansive conceptions of harm. So some philosophers nowadays would recognize not just that animals are capable of pleasure and pain, but that they're also capable of many other forms of behavior, and that these are significant in understanding animal well-being. So things like an animal's capacity to engage in social relationships, to exercise choice and agency in their lives, to live a relatively long life, to develop certain skills in the course of that life, to acquire certain kinds of knowledge. And even as some scholars are recognizing now, or starting to argue, to enjoy a degree of privacy in their behavior. Our conception of these things can influence how we're going to judge AI's capacity to cause harm to animals and what we need to do about it. So the upshot of this is that if we start off with a totally wrong conception of harm, we're going to end up in a problematic position where we're measuring the wrong things. If we have an incomplete or partially correct conception of what harm is for animals, that might sometimes be problematic. It might sometimes be okay. But I think it's good that we recognize that when we're trying to ascertain the harms that animals suffer from AI, so that we can avoid overestimating the ability of AI agents to make correct judgments about the harms that animals suffer. And so that we can avoid underestimating the kinds of harms that AI is now becoming implicated in with respect to animals. So that's the end of my section. And I'm now going to pass back to Christine to talk about the implications of AI for law and governance.
Thanks, Simon. So I'm going to wrap up with some suggestions about how we might, taking into account this sort of multi-species justice approach and the range of harms that AI might cause to animals, what are some practical ways in which we might be able to advocate to consider animal interests in AI-specific governance, and also how we might consider impacts of AI in the other areas where animal advocates have traditionally tried to further the interests of animals, such as animal welfare law and environmental law. So the first thing I want to say is that if we sort of think that, there has to be an AI for animals piece of legislation, and that's really the only thing that could look after animals in relation to AI, then, well, yes, that might be nice, but there are actually many potential avenues for animal advocacy and for animal impact assessment in relation to AI. So I'm just going to give a few quick ideas about some of these in a minute. So the first one is the EU general regulation of AI across sectors, of which the European Union's AI Act is the most comprehensive example in the Western world at the moment. But then we could also think about the fact that there are many ways in which AI is being used in different industry sectors, and regulations and standards are being developed in all these areas around the world, and animal interests could be considered there. So notable ones are in government decision making. There's quite a lot of activity happening, digital platform regulation and algorithmic recommenders, and I'm going to talk about that. And also things like standards for automated vehicles and standards for medical devices are areas where there's a lot of activity happening in AI governance at the moment that could incorporate animal interests. And then there's existing law in sectors where AI is being used and may impact animals, such as I mentioned before, animal welfare law, environmental or conservation law. but also areas like corporate governance, public sector governance, food safety law. So there's sort of two ways you can get to AI and animals. Quite often there's sort of the laws that are meant to be about the AI systems and often about foundation models and general purpose AI and then how that gets applied. So there's sort of going from that AI end, but there's also going from the end where we already have regulation for many areas of industry and then AI is being used in those areas. So a consideration of animals and AI could get included there. And then lastly, it's important to point out that, as I said at the beginning, even though we don't have a lot of hard law, there is a lot of soft law being developed, such as codes of ethics, technical standards, and voluntary measures like procurement standards and so on for AI. And so there's opportunities to influence the way soft law develops, which will probably end up influencing hard law. So I know I don't have much time, so I just want to mention three quick ideas. So one is general regulation of AI, such as the European AI Act. It's very human-centric at the moment. It's in the purposes, in the first recital, which you've got there in the little box. But there are opportunities because it talks about promoting human-centric and trustworthy AI with a high level of protection of health, safety, and fundamental rights, which is also defined to include environmental protection. So if we thought about what might animal interests mean there, we might think about, okay, so the EU AI Act outlaws certain high-risk uses of AI, and then other high-risk AI systems, it requires them to have risk management systems in place. So what if we thought about risk animals as helping to define what was a high-risk use of AI or what was a high-risk AI system? So then what we might find is that the use of AI in precision livestock farming we might be able to argue that should actually count as a high-risk AI system because those animals are going to be affected if it fails or if it, at the very least, if it fails or if it doesn't do what it says on the tin that it's going to do. We might even argue, well, really, this kind of use of AI in certain circumstances should be banned because what it's doing is biometric surveillance and categorization of animals against their own welfare, which if they were human, that kind of use of AI would be banned. So there's opportunities in thinking about what in the sort of risk approach that's developing to the regulation of AI to think about risks to animals. Environmental protection is also being recognized as a fundamental value, although it's kind of it's not as prominent as human rights. But in the EU already, there's been a call to develop a technical standard to assess environmental impact. And there are technical standards bodies working on how that's going to develop. And that's a big opportunity for animals and their individual interests as well as their species interests to be recognised. So same is happening in Australia. Environmental protection has been recognised as a fundamental value in all our proposals. The European approach is likely to have an impact on other jurisdictions as well and on the practices of the major AI providers because they need to sell into the European market. The second very quick example is specific AI governance measures. And a really great example is the use of animal impact assessment in relation to digital platforms. So Lev mentioned the animal impact assessment in the UK. That official animal impact assessment has actually been used with the Online Safety Act in the UK. The Online Safety Act requires digital platforms, social media platforms and search services to have in place systems to make sure that they prevent and take down illegal content. And at first that did not include animal cruelty illegal content, but it got included in a later draft, and the animal impact assessment took a look at that and said, yes, that's great. So now the platforms in the UK are going to have to make sure that they're actually looking for not just, child abuse and harmful pornography and so on, but also animal cruelty content. But the animal impact assessment also identified that some changes to the law need to happen to adequately account for what's going on with AI and digital media with animal cruelty content. And then the last category of things where I think that animal advocates could do a lot is with animal welfare and environmental laws. So coming from the other end to look at AI. So we recently wrote a submission to the Australian Animal Welfare Review saying, well, we need to actually make sure that we have systems and standards in place to regulate AI use in industrial animal farming, and that needs to be incorporated in the animal welfare system. We need laws to be updated to ensure responsibility and allocation of liability when AI is used to commit cruelty, which is currently unlawful. So if you think about something like AI-enabled digital sensing, which gives electric shocks to animals, then, well, that's a system that needs to be approved and regulated. Perhaps we would argue it shouldn't be allowed at all. If it is allowed and animals are given electric shocks above a very small amount that's been approved, then who would be liable for that? Will somebody be able to say, oh, it was the AI who did it, it wasn't me? AI-enabled wildlife crime is going to need more resources for monitoring and enforcement, because drones and hacking and so on are going to make it easier in a way for criminals to do the wrong thing. And so we need to sort of fight back. And then we also have a huge amount of data issues happening with all the data that's being collected about animals, mostly by environmentalists and others who are concerned about animals. But how do we know how this data is going to get used in the future, whether governments or industry or criminals who want to misuse that data against animal interests? What protection do we have that that data is going to be used in the interests of those animals and species? So we argue that there needs to be a principle of beneficence in the way that that data is used, and some sort of data guardian that speaks for animals. So I think there are a few ideas how animal advocates might look for ways to think about how to avoid the array of harms that might be caused to animals through AI, and also promote the benefits. Thank you.